Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this first ID20 Summit Sessions webinar. My name is Veneklasen, and I'm the Head of Advocacy and Communications here at ID 2020. In a normal year, we would have come together last month in New York City for the annual ID 2020 Summit. I think we can probably all agree that, however, that this has been anything but a normal year. On the one hand, the pandemic has made it infeasible for us to gather in person. On the other, it has brought digital ID technology into the public consciousness and given new urgency to our collective work. And this online format is great because it's allowing us to open these sessions to a broader audience, unconstrained by the limitations of space. We're delighted to have you here with us today as we present this opening session of this four-part series. This is part of our ongoing effort to keep our community connected, foster collaboration, and learn from one another. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our partners at Biometric Update for their support of the webinar series. And with that, it's my privilege to introduce our moderator for today's session, ID 2020's board chair, Kim Gagne. Kim joined ID 2020 this past April. He's a London-based strategic communications consultant with the advisory and advocacy communications firm APCO Worldwide. He also serves as the executive director of the European Cloud Alliance, a business coalition focused on policy issues related to cloud computing. Prior to joining APCO, Kim had a distinguished career at Microsoft, where he held a variety of senior public policy and management positions in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Going back a little bit further, Kim served as a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Department of State and was a partner in a Washington, D.C. law firm. So with that, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Kim, thank you so much for agreeing to host this opening session. Let me kick it over to you.
Thank you, Ethan. It's really a pleasure to be here moderating this panel that you and your team have brought together to share their thoughts on the future of digital ID and how we get there. It's particularly interesting for me because, as you said, I really started deep diving into this whole topic only 5 or 6 months ago, and I'm getting there, but I'm still on a steep learning curve, and hope as well as everybody else to benefit from the great panel we have sharing their thoughts today. Certainly, digital ID can be a powerful tool, enabling each of us to exercise our rights and protections under the law, access critical social services such as education and healthcare, and to participate in an increasingly digital economy. ID 2020 was launched in 2016 to foster collaboration among the private sector, government, and nonprofit organizations towards a common vision, which is simply stated, good ID for all. Being able to prove our identity is a prerequisite to a life of dignity and opportunity. So as we work to achieve our vision of good ID for all, we are reminded that 1 in 7 people on Earth, fully 1.1 billion people, lack any widely accepted means to prove their identity. We all deserve better forms of ID that are privacy protecting, user controlled, portable, and persistent throughout our lives. But we won't get there without a sustained focus and commitment to serve the needs of society's most vulnerable. As Ethan noted in his introduction, talking a little bit about the logistics of this year's summit, the pandemic has brought digital ID technology into a new space, and certainly has brought it into the public consciousness. This moment offers an opportunity to make significant progress towards our vision, but it also presents considerable risks and challenges which must be overcome. This is a pivotal moment for the digital ID industry, and the stakes are unquestionably high. With that rather ominous sounding note, let me say that I am in fact very optimistic. We at ID 2020 believe that with good ID technology based on a common set of standards and tested and proved in the field, as well as the appropriate legal and operational frameworks, and open and transparent engagement with a wide array of stakeholders, we can get there. So the question we will be exploring today is how we will get there. We have a great panel for you today, so let me take a moment to introduce them. I'm sure you can see them all on your screens. Simon McDougall serves as the Deputy Commissioner for Regulatory Innovation and Technology in the UK Information Commissioner's Office. He is responsible for leading the work of the Technology Policy and Innovation Directorate, ensuring delivery of ICO's strategic goals through stakeholder liaison, guidance, research, and international activity. Simon's work includes helping the ICO identify, understand, and address emerging technologies with privacy implications, supporting the ICO's innovation agenda, and making the ICO more tech savvy. Welcome, Simon. Ankur Patel is the Principal Program Manager for Digital Identity at Microsoft. Over the past few years, Ankur has helped lead the effort to transform Microsoft's digital identity team and develop product offerings that deliver industry-leading identity and access management services for consumers and enterprises around the world. Christine Leong leads Accenture's decentralized identity and biometrics group globally and is also part of the global blockchain leadership team. She brings more than 20 years of experience in technology with a specific focus on security to the discussion. She has been supporting Accenture's thought leadership and investments in blockchain since 2014. And in addition to her work at Accenture, Christine is also the program advisor to World Economic Forum's Initiative for Identity in the Digital World and the Known Traveler Digital Identity Project. And speaking of the World Economic Forum, Sheila Warren is the head of blockchain and distributed ledger technology at the World Economic Forum. She began her career as a Wall Street attorney before turning to philanthropy and civic technology more than a decade ago. Over the course of her career, Sheila has represented banks, philanthropists, and progressive nonprofits, most recently serving as a vice president of strategic alliances and general counsel at TechSoup. She also designed and launched NGO Source, a groundbreaking service focused on international grant making. Sheila currently serves on the boards of the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California, the Equal Justice Society, and the Data Ethics for All Initiative. As you can see, we have an incredible range of talent on the panel with us today. Now let me talk about how we'll proceed for the next 50 or so minutes. Each panelist is going to start with about 5 minutes of opening remarks. That will follow in the order that they were just introduced. Then I'll pose some questions and try to start a discussion, or as Ethan likes to say, an argument. I'm hoping we can make this a really interactive session. So panelists, please feel free to pose questions to one another along the way. We'll also be taking audience questions. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll get to as many of them as possible within the allotted time. With that, I'll turn to you, Simon, for 5 or so minutes of your introductory remarks.
Kim, thank you, and thank ID 2020 for inviting me here. And it's great to be here virtually, and it's great to be among a really expert group of panelists. And on some levels, I was reflecting on the expertise of the panelists, and I think in terms of the questions around digital identity, I'm probably the least expert from a technical point of view. So I'm going to kick off by making a plea. I'm going to kick off making a plea for trust and engagement, hearts and minds. I think there's an awful lot of innovation, a lot of it COVID-driven in this space right now. It's a truly exciting time to be discussing digital ID. And it's very easy sometimes to focus on what could be done and the benefits that could be accrued by different digital ID schemes. We need to bring our communities, our audience, our users along with us, whoever they may be around the world. And in terms of the amount of effort needed to bring those communities along, I think we need to think a really large number in our mind in terms of people hours needed, and then double it and double it again. because we are swimming against the tide in terms of trust in innovation and technology around the world. Now that's not a situation, a challenge unique to digital identity, of course. We've had declining trust in both government institutions and in technology solutions over a number of years, and that's manifested itself politically, socially, in many ways, and we're all, I think, struggling with those consequences. But any innovation in this space will be very squarely against those themes, those prevailing winds. And if we look even at where we are, at least in the UK and the US, and I'd love to hear if there are different views from around the world on this, in terms of people's concern around COVID and utility of face masks, vaccines, various conspiracy theories, we can imagine those folks' reaction to well-meaning attempts to bring in an ID card system. In the UK, my office, I should say actually, as well as all the things you mentioned, Kim, I'm the accountable executive at the ICO for all of our COVID work. So we have a dedicated team who had since March working on all manner of things, from the contact tracing app through to health data sharing, through to customer logs and the like. And if we look at the questions that arose from contact tracing as an example, even with a very robust solution which we have now, and a decentralized solution, and a solution which has been incredibly transparent about the risks that it's facing, the approaches it's taking. It's published a lot of work, including state protection impact assessment. There is still a lot of mistrust and a lot of pushback among communities. And that was one of the main learnings that came out of all the pilot work. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as we talk around different digital ID solutions. One of the things that came out of that the pilots on that struck me, and obviously we're there as a regulator, advisor, and a supervisor rather than actually owning that particular product, I should say, that they learned from the pilots is that to bring users along and to actually have widespread adoption, you have to engage with a range of voices, a range of communities, because different people will listen to different people. And very, very often it's people closest to them. It's community leaders, it's family, it's friends. Sometimes it's authority figures. Sometimes it's people who aren't authority figures and but they've got more popular backgrounds. But you need to actually have a multifaceted approach. And so as we go into these discussions that we will have here around different ways to build meaningful digital identity solutions, then we need to keep that in mind. In the UK, many people on this conference and the speakers will be familiar with the UK government's recent response to its call for evidence around digital ID. And that included, among other things, some excellent principle-based standards to work against, and a really useful high-level apparatus to adopt. And I think we have to have those kind of markers in place if we are going to navigate this, because as we go on building schemes, especially schemes that either have strong government influence or have government standard setting, then it's easy to get lost in the minutiae. It's easy to have scope creep and add extra utility to it, thinking everyone must always realize that extra utility will be good. And in doing so, you create risk around the level of adoption of any scheme. And finally, on that point, I would say, wouldn't I, but I will say it, you need to have a meaningful legal and regulatory framework that respects rights and privacy, which interacts with and upholds any kind of digital identity. So I think there's key principles there around transparency, accountability, security. People want to see that. And as we've gone through the COVID crisis and we've worked through different schemes with the government, we've seen that actually privacy is very important to how people see their interaction with government at a time when governments are having to be more interventionist and sometimes, even if I say so, authoritarian than they would normally be. So we need to embrace the challenges of regulation rather than see them as a barrier, and see regulation and consumer trust as two key facets for any successful ventures into digital ID.
That's great. That's great. I appreciate your overview. That actually tees up some of the discussion we'll be getting into shortly. Ankur, can I turn to you for some perspectives?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. I've been part of ID 2020's technical working group for 3 years now, maybe 4. I don't know. Time passes by very quickly. And our investment in this space started, in fact, with a workshop that UN hosted 4 years ago. And it was around identity for the displaced individuals. And we came to realize that the technologies and solutions we've been building to date are not appropriate to address that audience. As Simon calls out, there is variance in needs depending on whom you are connecting with and to what end. So our team is responsible for the front door to all of Microsoft, consumer identity systems, which could be Xbox, HoloLens, Windows, Outlook, etc., or enterprise identity systems, which then powers most of Fortune 500 or many governments around the world. But we found ourselves that it would not be appropriate to tell somebody from seeking aid or refuge halfway across the world to say, you need to go get an account from Microsoft in Redmond, Washington to get your aid. That is not appropriate. And the reason we care about it is because our mission statement is to empower every person and every business on the planet to achieve more. And we're not living up to that mission statement if we can't address the needs for a large size of the population. As you said in your introductory remarks, it's 1 billion people and growing. And what is considered displaced now, as policy dictates, is getting more murky around what the governance framework you would be operating in. Just take your example on what Christine and Sheila referred to as on your well-known traveler ID thing. How do you establish that, and how will we know who is safe to travel and where can they travel? We try to do that for 20 million businesses to be able to just work with each other in a business to business sense. And we know how difficult it is. And it's difficult from a technical standpoint. It is difficult from a regulatory concern and audit perspective. So when we think about addressing such a need for 7 billion people on the planet, we know we need to do something different than what we have been doing to date. So all of this work we've been doing so far has been a new hypothesis. And Microsoft itself has been working on it for 20 years. Previously, it was Passport or some other version of it. And we're trying a new attempt again at that same problem, because the problem hasn't been addressed yet, on how do we actually empower people to own and control their own digital identity. We've come to learn that what we have today is a whole bunch of digital accounts that we lease from various technology providers, but we don't actually have our own digital identity. You'd have to piece it together across these digital data islands and then try to make sense of it. So this latest attempt is to say, can we give you some different kind of tools by which all of us can be empowered to understand our own identities better in the digital sphere? In that regard, we are behind in analog compared to the analog world. So the 3 things that are different than our previous attempts is that there are open standards now. And there are bodies like W3C, which are super mature. There's places like Decentralized Identity Foundation where we can go and have these conversations. There are places like ID 2020, which are fostering a set of disparate people to come and talk about and finding common ways to demonstrate interoperability and have certification marks against it. These things didn't exist 15 years ago. We have cell phones in everyone's pocket now, and there are cell phones available for just about anyone and everyone on it to have connectivity that you can test what is truth, if you will, in a verifiable way. That didn't exist. And then finally, we have a huge push, as Simon said, on ease of use of these systems. Previously, these were forte of enterprises to do, and now we have all this being consumerized and put in people's pocket. So I think we've come a long way than where we had in 15 years. And I'm hoping that we can find a common ground here on policy, technology, and customer advocacy to say, how can we do not just security and ease of use, but also verifiability and privacy? So I'm keen to engage with the rest of the quorum here, including participants, on their perspectives on how the progress is being made and what are some of the key things we should focus on. So thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you, Ankur. That's some terrific thoughts. And again, we'll tee up some interesting exchanges amongst you all. Christine, if we can now turn to you for some remarks, that'd be great.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for inviting me, and very glad to be part of the ID 2020 summit discussion this year. Again, for those of you who have attended in previous years, probably heard me speak on a number of different occasions. Proud to be talking with ID 2020 for now, I think, 3-4 years as part of the summits for some time. And I think what's from an Accenture's perspective, we are with what Ankur said, and as part of what we're doing with Sheila and the forum, digital identity is very, very much a big agenda item for Accenture. And why? Because it matters to all of us. And my boss often says that I'm actually probably the best use case for a better digital identity, not because I'm necessarily unfortunate and displaced, but for those who have heard me speak before. I moved from the UK. I'm a UK citizen. I moved from the UK to the US. Now, during COVID, back to the UK again. And many of you have heard, when I moved to the US, I moved from London to Houston to New York in different years. I had to redo all of my identity proofing to get a bank account. I couldn't get medication, couldn't get any credit. An example I always use is that I'm a managing director and global lead for Accenture. You think that with someone who's relatively educated, relatively decent paid, that I wouldn't be able to get myself into problems, would be able to get recognized, being able to get paid, get my prescription, get all of that. Actually, it's hard. It's really hard. And now that I'm back in the UK again with 7 years being away, I'm having to reestablish my credit records, having to reestablish all my identity records, re-register, and to tell a funny story. I've been with Accenture for 10 years. I have to fill out all of our HR forms to reprove my employment credentials, because it needs to be in person due to regulation. Yeah, so because of COVID, I moved back halfway through. All of the passport on the video call, I have to stick the passport up on the video, so on and so forth. All of that, how can that be right in this day and age? If it's that difficult for me, it will be immensely difficult for those that are displaced, for those that are in a less educated, in a less privileged environment than myself. And all of that has an impact. And COVID has highlighted this, that we may all be able to work and be very productive working remotely, as we have done for months and months and months now. But many of our processes today around proving our identity still requires physical interaction, physical ink, physical identity proofing, and showing documentation, showing credentials. And as Ankur said, it's much of a few of the things that we're doing today around sort of travel and enabling nations to reopen their borders and be able to get us back onto planes again and help economic growth. Some of those things, a lot of them require the equivalent of a passport, but with health, right? So how do we show all of that and share of this digital verifiable information ahead of time, so that this is going to be as important, our health credential is going to be as important as our digital identity, and a critical part of our digital identity in moving forward while keeping our data, private and secure, so that everybody in the world can leverage it and become part of what we are.
That's terrific. Thank you, Christine. Appreciate particularly sharing your own personal stories of the need to re-identify, even for a person with your background. It's extraordinary. Sheila, off mute now, please.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks, Christine, for that. It actually segs into something where I was going to go, which is, we've been talking about identity and forms for, a very long time, since the beginning, I would argue, really, of the internet explosion. And we tended to focus, and I certainly focused, I'd say a decade ago, really on credentialing. And some of the things I think that other panelists have talked about, which is this notion that I wanted to be able to prove that I was a graduate of my institution, or that I was I was licensed attorney in California, New York, and like things like this. And I was pretty comfortable as an individual going through the world, outsourcing that credentialing to the Bar Association or whatever it might be, having my health records held in other places. And then something happened that really snapped me out of this and caused me to think about this in a very different way. And so I will tell a personal story as well, building on Christine's opening that door. I was in the hospital giving birth to my first daughter. And this was about 8 years ago. And my identity was stolen. I was a victim of identity theft while I was literally in the hospital. And when I heard about this, when you're a new mother, you're there's a lot of emotions, shall we say. And my concern was not, my bank account, which is usually everyone's first concern. It was, oh my God, are they going to be able to get access to my baby in some fashion? Like, there's not a rational thought. But when you're in the hospital, what happens with your child is you get a wristband, your child gets an ankle band, and every single time you go to feed that baby or you send them to the nursery, they go get their shot or whatever, they match up the bands. And what occurred to me then, for really the first time, was, oh my goodness, what if I lost the band, someone stole the band? What on earth would that mean? Someone could walk out of the hospital with my child. And even now, I think about how emotional I was at that time. But that's where I went. And so I think we all have identified that one of the big barriers here is the adoption cycle. Like, how do we get people to kind of care about this? And why is it that people care about identity? Well, in my particular case of that example, again, take my money, just give me my baby. It was kind of where I was, right? But I think we have to think about user value in a really real way. And what is the incentive for people to do this? So I think Christine pointed out some of these examples. Voting in some parts of the world, access to healthcare, social services. Ultimately, I think we're moving down a path where very quickly, stimulus payments, welfare payments, things like this. I do spend a lot of time in the blockchain digital assets world, in addition to data policy, which I also head at the forum. And we talk an awful lot about crypto and stablecoin and different forms of digital currencies. And we talk about, there's a lot of hype about financial inclusion being aided by this. Some of it's real, some of it's not. But the bottom line is, barriers to financial inclusion are really not about the form of currency. That's going to help. The barrier is digital identity. The biggest barrier to financial inclusion, to economic opportunity, to being a participant in the global digital economy is the lack of a digital identity, period. That is it. That is the number one issue, more than anything else. And if we solve that, it's going to pave the way for a lot of technologies that exist today. Blockchain distributed ledger, a lot of innovation around zero knowledge proof. So there's a lot of ways you can secure some of the elements that you need to establish your identity, but you're going to unlock opportunity for so many people, and some of the billion people that are currently without identity. I think it's important to note these different frames. So when we think about adoption, it's important also to recognize that the adoption from one side is very obvious. I mean, we can talk about Aadhaar ad nauseum. There was a reason that, there's a reason any government wants to know who people are, where they're going, who they're talking to, how they're credentialed, all of that. But it's really important, I think we've touched on this, you can hear a theme from all of us, that equal access is extremely important. And I would say that equal access in a non-exploitative way, and that is truly non-colonialist. It's something I think about an awful lot. There is this notion that a lot of the underserved are in parts of the world that don't have the technical capabilities. That is actually not necessarily true. And what I think we see is this really Western notion of identity that gets exported in many places. And I find that philosophically problematic. I think we're doing a better job of in the digital identity space than in many other technical spaces. But I would encourage us to really check ourselves and think a lot about what frame of reference we're bringing to the notion of identity culturally and how that translates into technical solutions that we are building.
Thank you, Sheila. Terrific comments. And like Christine, your sharing of the personal story really drives home sort of the deep-held necessity or deep-held emotion, actually, that comes as a result of the necessity for us getting this right and moving this forward. I mean, your story of the baby in the hospital, I would resonate, I think, with just about everybody. And I can't wait to see you getting somebody out in California to write that up as a script for a TV drama. It's quite extraordinary. I'm going to pose a few questions for the panel now. I would like to remind everybody who is listening to us to please submit your own questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. After we go through a round of questions that I put forward, I'll be looking at yours and seeing how many of them we have time for folks to get to. But let me start with a question to you, Simon. I'll give a little bit of a long-winded preface, but it's meant because I think it's going to capture, points made by each of you as we get there. So I want the background for the question is this: as an industry, we're progressing on essentially 4 different paths. We have a technology path. Digital ID technology continues to evolve. We have an implementation path. Implementers identify appropriate uses for digital ID and think about how they can manage the transition to the actual usage. We have a path for the development of common standards and any necessary legislative and regulatory frameworks. And finally, we have an adoption path, which will ask end users to incorporate these new mechanisms for identity proofing into their daily lives. Okay, so to Simon, which of these paths do you see poses the greatest challenges, and what do we need to overcome it?
That's a great question. I'm going to surprise the audience now by saying I don't think it's common standards. I think that there is, the as somebody on the, when I think here we're very good.
Simon, I think we're having some audio issues. Could be you'll be able to correct them by just pausing for a second. You're
right.
Frozen now. Would someone else like to jump in and choose theirs, and then we'll come back to Simon as soon as we can get him back technology enabled. So again, we have a technology path, an implementation path for developing standards, and an adoption path. And the question is,
I'm happy to jump in with, yeah,
okay, please.
I think I hinted at this. So, I do think that adoption is, I think it's the biggest challenge. Is it I think your question actually was, which is the most important? And it's very, they really go together. I think that we have to look at adoption and implementation together, because you certainly can have mass adoption, which is mandatory. It's mandated by an authority, whether that's a giant corporation that has, tons of users, whether it's a government that requires it for use of services. We've kind of seen a couple of these things happen. But, is that the best way to go about it? It's certainly effective when it comes to implementation and forced adoption, but I would argue that it leads to a pretty narrow path forward. And certainly if we're talking about user control or self-sovereign entity, which I think is what we really are going for here, you really have to start with the user value and the adoption path, and then think about how you can create an implementation path that accommodates or orients in that way. So I would focus on adoption, but with a caveat that I think that all of the other things are critically important as well. And I certainly wouldn't want to have to hierarchically rank them, because that would be, I think, impossible.
Okay.
And
Simon, you want to?
Go
ahead, let's see.
Everything Sheila said, but also I'd say the one thing I would say is common standards. I actually don't think that that is as critical as you might expect a regulator to say it is at this point in time. I think we have a lot of innovation in this space. We have technologies that have matured very quickly, and we should allow ourselves to be innovation-led and adoption-led. In the end, in terms of sustainability of any solution and widespread adoption, I think adherence to regulation is important, but common standards less so, because I think we can let 1,000 flowers bloom to an extent, and then work on interoperability and commonality of standards as we see solutions become more dominant. So I would be wary of focus too much.
Okay, well, I think we got your point now. I think we had a little technical glitch there right at the end of your comment, but it is interesting when you talk about the adoption. Simon, are you frozen or? All right, I'll save my question for later on that one. Christine or Ankur, do you have any comment or choices among those four as to which is really maybe not the most important, but the most challenging, if you will?
Sure. I'm happy to pipe up. I agree with Sheila. My motto right now is adoption, 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 adoption. Actually, I think, on sort of things like technical standards and the technology itself, technology is probably by far and away the easiest part, not just because I work in primarily a technology space, and there are many amazing technical folks working on standards, but adoption is something that needs to happen to absolutely everyone. There needs to be a value, like exactly what Sheila said. I couldn't agree with her more, is that there needs to be user value. In order for all of us to use it, we need to see value in it. It needs to be easy to use. It needs to be accepted everywhere. So we might see value, all of us, in having a mobile phone, but if no one else can receive our calls, what's the point? We might see value in, there's an electronic or card payment, but like MasterCard, if it's not accepted everywhere, what's the point of bringing it out of my wallet, right? So I think that aspects of adoption in terms of for individual of personal value, so that they use it, they protect it, they respect the identity that they need to secure it and make it private, as well as the organizations that accept it and say, right, there is a need for us. It makes our businesses more efficient to run. It makes it easier for us to sell to our customers, to retain our customers, so on and so forth, or to manage their data somehow, whatever it may be. There needs to be value and adoption from both an acceptance aspect and a user adoption aspect.
Thank you. Ankur, do you have something? I saw you nodding in agreement on one point there.
Yeah, I mean, look, maybe this is again because we are technology people. Tech is the easy part. That's not the interesting bit. And it's ironic saying that's my job basically. But what we've come to realize that it's easy to build things. It's hard to get that use out of it, right? So the very first thing in any of my talks we'll talk about that ease of use part that Christine was just describing. And the ease of use is really about equitable exchange, as Sheila mentioned earlier in the conversation, that we need systems which are equitable. Today, they're not equitable. The exchange is not equitable. And that's what causes that friction in the system. And eventually the thing falls apart. So we will see innovative products come around and they will have a huge spike, and then that app disappears. Because it's not sustainable for the reasons that Christine was describing around it. So a lot of our work for the last 4 years, it's taken that long, is to drive that adoption, creating paths. Clearly, we have a huge channel. I can go and affect 800 million monthly active users around the world. I can affect 20 million businesses around the world. But creating a feature, not just showing up as new and novel, but showing up as it will create equitable exchange between them. So it's sustainable. So they're invested in growing it. So it's convenient to use, and it doesn't trade off on, we try to build security products. The number one thing that compromises security is convenience. You will write it down on a piece of paper faster than you're going to put your thumb on something. And I think until we make these ideas more convenient for people, for businesses, for regulators, it will not root. And we will, our biggest competition is status quo. Like, we are creatures of habit, and we will sooner rely on that than something new and cool. So I think it's super important that we always think about all four of these facets as opposed to trade-off. In any one of these, it will just not work.
Okay. Great, thank you. I'm going to move on, but Ankur, since I've got you on the line, I think I'll put the next question to you first.
Sure.
More than half of all Americans have at one time or another been affected by data breach or identity theft. And according to a recent report from KPMG, 91% of Americans believe corporations should take the lead when it comes to data responsibility. But at the same time, 84% are also open to state legislatures playing a more prescriptive role in giving customers more control over their data. How do you, looking ahead, how do you see this balance between market forces and regulation should play out? And Simon, this may loop back a little bit to your comments about the relative role of standard setting and so forth, as opposed to a more free market orientation, letting the thousand flowers bloom. So Ankur, please.
So as an American, check. Data compromised, check. As an immigrant, having to face those different jurisdictional boundaries around it, check. So this problem is, again, I think it's a false dichotomy to create this trade-off between should it be enterprises, should it be a regulator's, should it be even my personal responsibility as the person who's spewing all this digital litter all over the internet, and what should I be accountable to or responsible for? So I think it's about, again, that equitable exchange. Can I create a set of tools by which each of us can do our jobs and not overfunction? And that's what we've been trying to enable, is how do I make it possible for a user to grant permission to their information in an informed manner, not consent, where like, did I take the Facebook quiz or did I release that data to Cambridge Analytica? I have proving it. Some IT administrator in Facebook is going to go prove that. And so we're not talking about Cambridge Analytica being responsible there, nor me. There's a third party involved now. And then there is regulators. So I would rather we consider thinking about what is the responsibility of an issuer for an attestation that says you have credit limit, or you're allowed to travel, or you are safe to work, or whatever it might be. What is the responsibility of me as a subject to present this fact to someone and know that I'm interacting with somebody that I know and trust or whatever? And how might I, as a service provider, present myself in a trusted manner and then give you the rights to say, we engaged in this exchange of information. Here's what our obligations are. And that is convenient. It's easy, as Christine pointed out, because otherwise everybody will need to hire a set of lawyers to do this and not live our lives, which is not the goal here, right? So our biggest push in this has been to break this down, and the true decentralization that's taking place in our mind is not a technical one. It's one about these roles and responsibilities, and then creating a set of tools that live up to that, and then work with regulators around the world to say, hey, what if a data subject was also a data controller? What might that look like to you? How might you govern that differently? Right? So I think we are coming to a point where there's a new set of investments we as a community can make, both on technical front as well as regulatory front, to look at this idea differently than this trade-off that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you. I'll just open it up for other panelists. Simon, you want to?
Yeah, very much in agreement with everything that Ankur said there. And as a privacy regulator, we're very interested in imbalances of power. Very often, especially in the world of large digital platforms, there's, that you have very sophisticated organizations offering services and individuals not fully understanding the services, and that's not unique to digital identity at all. But that's an ongoing discussion where approaches which are simply buyer beware don't really work. There's got to be a level of accountability to the organization. I should say Microsoft it has a very strong record in that, and has remained engaging the privacy discussion over many years. So it's not a criticism of Microsoft in any way at all. Another thing at the back of my mind, though, which we haven't raised, is very crudely, no matter what solution we end up going to, it's either got to be heavily state-backed and the state picks up the tab, or it's got to make someone somewhere some money. And that's really hard. It's really, really hard. And in the UK, we've flip-flopped a little bit on this and tried to look at ideas of having the governments, kind of go all in, in the mid 2000s with the ID card scheme we had there and drive that, and then step back and try and provide, quite an arm's length platform and let the private sector magically build solutions, which didn't quite work either. And now we're kind of moving towards half and half in terms of providing platforms and standards and frameworks to use by encouraging private sector organizations to provide services. And I think, that's the challenge. And that's where the technology innovation and the real policy come together, because some of the innovations that are coming through the market enable more frictionless transactions and, new solutions with much lower overheads. But if it's not going to be an entirely state-backed solution, they've still got to actually pay their way. And again, I'm happy to be corrected by people who have looked at this more around the world right now, but it feels to me that we're still trying to work out how those business models work and how all the players in that chain actually turn a buck.
I would like to respond to that as the guy trying to sell the product on this, right? So the business model on this is also decentralized in that same regard, right? Instead of saying it's one or other, we can say you pay for what you are accountable for. And so a university can be accountable for, as Sheila pointed out, for her education credential. And the hospital is responsible for the hospital certification, as NHS is doing in UK, and we're working with them on it. Or somebody is responsible for, and I'm responsible for hiring you. And we can post these things on LinkedIn as a place to say you're a verified professional, because my identity is made up of one of these things. It's several of these things. And there is a market incentive for every one of them. So take your university one. It costs a university, at least in America, between $5 and $20 to mint a transcript. If I could digitize that for a fraction of it, they're incented for getting their students to be hired faster than somebody else. So there is good market economics and incentives for it. For our part, we can make LinkedIn a place for you to post those things and be verifiable and checkable, right? So a lot of this is incentive design that we need to do in order for the right behavior outcomes to occur. The technology part is a necessary part. The policy part too is maybe a necessary part. But until we create a good incentive design that is open, fair, and equitable, equally addressable, not through some weird constraints created through consortiums in the marketplace, it won't work.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump to the next question, and this is really going to be a combination of something I had prepared, but also a question which is coming in from the audience, and so I think that'll make the transition to more audience-generated questions in the short time we have remaining. And naturally, it concerns COVID, because that's driving so much of the way we're all living and working these days. So COVID has brought digital technology into common discussion, whether we're talking about immunization certificates or the use of digital ID to streamline the delivery of government services and benefits. There's no question that the pandemic is having a catalytic effect on our industry. So two questions arise from that. Are you worried that solutions that are not ready for prime time will be rushed to market? And what are the risks that poses for good digital ID? And secondly, is there a necessary trade-off between functionality and inclusivity in that we need to get a large segment of the global population covered as quickly as we can, but not everybody has the internet access that might be necessary for a fully functional solution. Christine, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. So let me try and answer backwards. In terms of the aspects of not everyone have access and ability to sort of internet access and so on and so forth. I think to Sheila's point earlier, there are in many developing countries and in many areas with sort of difficult access, people find a way. And in my work, at least with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, we often see that in refugee camps and whatnot, people do find a way, and people do find a way to get access, and are incredibly actually innovative in terms of how to get access. And I think there needs to, of course, from a design or solution perspective, we need to take into consideration that some people are not going to have internet access or have intermittent internet access. In fact, and how do we then develop solutions that have, for example, what we call custody capabilities that enables other, or delegation to enable other trusted authorities, whether it's someone's parents, someone's family, some government entity, NGO, to take care of their identity for them. And I think that's always necessary. And to think about solutions that actually you might not need to do something every week. You can do something once a month, and different permutations and combinations, so to enable people who are not necessarily technically savvy to be able to use the solution, as well as people who don't have continuous connectivity to be able to use the solutions, or different form factors that are not just smartphone based. It might be analog phones based, it might be smart card based, it might be some in person with a piece of paper, and then it's digital. The multiple ways of doing things.
Terrific. Sheila, I'm going to jump to the next question, just because it may well be our last. But again, this is one that is a sort of a combination of something that has arisen from the audience and something I was interested in asking you all about anyway. And well, I'll kind of pose two questions, and you can, like Christine, choose which one suits you in terms of beginning your answer. So the first question is, what potential use cases for digital ID excite you the most? And the second is, what are some examples of user-centric digital solutions being implemented successfully? So, have a go.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first, and I'll this is showing my own bias here potentially, but I really do think that financial inclusion is where I'm really excited about this, and that's in part because it's the area that I focused on a lot of the forum. I think a lot about digital assets, decentralized finance, how new systems, decentralized systems, or blockchain-backed systems potentially, but really in general, digital asset systems as a general matter, can really expand the opportunities that are open to people. And I do want to go back though and address something that Christine said and build on that a bit, which is, this is exactly right. And I think it's so important that we not look at infrastructure challenges as barriers to building, but that we ensure that we are accommodating those very real infrastructure challenges in our design. And I think that is just incredibly important. And I think that some sectors, some industries have dealt with that better than others. And you kind of see that, and I think the financial sector as a general matter is quite far ahead of many other sectors in terms of thinking about some of these challenges. And of course, I completely forgot your second question.
No, that's fine. Would anyone else like to share some thoughts about that? The sort of the most exciting digital ID potential use cases, and perhaps the most successful digital ID use cases.
Well, Kim, I have a thought which kind of ties in this point to your previous question as well, which is, at least in the UK, I'm alarmed with where we're going with the digital ID discussion, because it feels like we have a funny twin track discussion. The government's recent paper on digital ID was really thoughtful and envisaged a pathway which will take years, and will build a framework along the way which makes sense and is practical. And at the same time, we've successfully implemented in England and Wales an app and a separate app in Scotland, a separate app in Northern Ireland for COVID, covering exposure notifications. And one in England and Wales has lots of other functionality in it. And there's plenty of people saying, well, what can we tag onto that? Anticipating immunity certifications, maybe vaccine certification in the future, etc., etc. So we have this roller coaster of a COVID ride, which could easily end up implementing quite ham-fisted digital identity by the back door in some ways, and a more thoughtful process which is rumbling along, which is almost entirely separate. And I don't quite know what the end game is for that. We could easily end up, I think, in a year's time, 18 months' time, finding that there's a de facto standard out there which hasn't come from the thoughtful process. It's come reverse engineered from COVID, which might not be where we want to be.
Yeah, I like to add to that also. And one of the, and of course, in terms of the, completely agreeing with Simon on the fact that there are, COVID with all of the, some of the health capability we're building now sits on top of a digital identity. It has to. Because otherwise, without that, how do you know that I'm the person who took the COVID test that enables me to get on the plane to then land in a different country and hopefully don't have to quarantine, right? Otherwise, it's somebody else who took the test and it's not me. Then, and if I'm infected, then that gets devoids all of those steps altogether. So it's almost COVID has accelerated some of the demand and some of what we are doing today in conjunction with the forum for the known traveler digital identity. Of course, I'm a little bit biased, so I'm going to say the most successful and my favorite project is, of course, the known traveler digital identity, only because it's backed by 2 governments and a lot of other governments are looking at it now and are able to support not just a digital identity from a passport standpoint cross-border between government Netherlands and Canada, but also that it can incorporate something like a health certificate. Soon enough, the health certificate is going to be more important than our passport when we cross border, because I'm going to need that when I enter a restaurant, when I enter a shop, this morning when I enter a vet, so all of that, I think is critically important. And most people, I think, don't necessarily associate that with an identity. They associate that as, well, you need a health credential, whether it's a vaccine, a record, in those days, for those that are as old as me, you remember the old yellow fever and dengue fever piece of paper, right? But, in these days, hopefully it will be on one of these. So we can share that in advance digitally. Wouldn't it be great if we can share that before we even leave the house? So we know that when I leave the house, even though I have a really sore throat, people don't think that I really have COVID, because I don't. And wouldn't that be great that if people do have COVID, then we know that they don't need to leave the house and don't need to go and infect everybody else. And I think that aspect of, and going back to the point earlier around value, having that identity, being able to share a trusted credential is what having a good identity is all about.
Thank you very much. And it's probably a good place for us to end. We're very near the end of our allotted hour, but it's also a good place to end because we're talking about COVID and the challenge it's posing for all of us. And first, in closing, I should say thank you to all of the panelists and to all of the audience. Look, we're all doing our best. It would be great for everybody to be assembling in New York, and then we could follow up all these discussions, and we do have a long list of questions that have come in from the audience that we're not able to get to, and you could be pulled into the side meeting rooms or the cafeteria and get your ears bent with requests for further information. But we're doing our best to share things, and I think we had some valuable points raised today. I won't try and summarize things. I'll throw out a few words that are going to stick with me from this. Adoption as something that everybody needs to be totally focused upon. Urgency is the second one. And then finally, in light of the COVID thing, proceeding with urgency, but with an eye towards, not letting small s standards emerge to deal with the COVID situation that really won't be suitable over the longer term. So thank you all for your thoughts on those issues and on others. I want to give everybody a heads up that our next ID 2020 Summit session is 2 weeks from today on October 15th. It's going to be about digital immunization certificates, designing for a new era in global health. As today, we had a we will have a terrific panel, including Seth Berkeley of Gavi, Sky Gilbert of Digital Squared Path, Ariel Alano of Block Solutions, and Brad Perkins of the Commons Project, and ID 2020 Executive Dakota Gruner will serve as moderator. And undoubtedly you do a great job. So thank you to all of you who participated. We have a good crowd today, and thank you particularly to the panelists for sharing your thoughts and preparing well for this session. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks. So long.